Good evening, Disobey. Do you ever get the feeling that there has to be more to life than just computers and hacking? The great thing about Disobey is that this isn't only for us who enjoy breaking things. This is also for creators and makers. Today is Valentine's Day, and what would be a more beautiful thing to make than love? So, let's get physical. But before we do that, we would really like to present our latest research on credential theft. We will start the presentation by giving a brief history of the evolution of credential theft attacks and the related defenses. And hopefully this will show you why we felt that a new approach to stealing credentials was needed. Then we will share the story of how we developed a new tool called FisMemToProfit, which is designed to steal credentials directly from the physical memory. And this is something that we're open sourcing today. So you are the first people outside F-Secure to see this. Now, hopefully this is all very interesting for those of you in the audience who self-identify as attackers or red teamers. But what about the defenders? For the defenders, we have three key takeaways. Number one, we will advise how to approach this kind of new and novel attack techniques in general. Key point number two, we will give recommendations on where to focus your detection efforts. And finally, key point number three, we see both attacks and defenses moving lower and lower on the technology stack. And we believe this is a trend that benefits the defenders. But it does require action from you. If you have any questions during the presentation, I kindly ask you to make a mental note, and we're more than happy to answer your questions in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. My name is Timo Hirvonen. This is my brilliant colleague, Robert Bearsby. Robert moved from UK to Finland about a year ago, and he is such a good Finn that we've already given him the Finnish name Roope Karhula. But that's not the reason why he is here. Robert is the father of the idea behind all this.
Thank you, mate. So recently, Timo and I were struggling to get code execution on a red team operation. And the reason for this was something called attack surface reduction, which is part of the advanced threat protection suite offered by Microsoft. According to Microsoft, attack surface reduction is a tool that prevents behaviors that malware often uses to infect computers with malicious code. I found this frustrating, but I also thought it was quite interesting. So I started reading about it. My wife went to bed, I carried on reading about it, and my curiosity led me to several other tool sets as well. What I found is that these modern defensive security software or solutions are effective, they're sophisticated, and they're really focusing on the right things. The problem for me was that the things they're focusing on are so pivotal to the success of our red team operations. Made me realize that the game is changing. It's time for us to sink or swim. And it made me realize that I just wanted to kind of push back. So I sent a message to my good friend and colleague Timo, and I said, Timo, the game is changing. It's time to sink or swim. I want to push back. And now Timo spent 6 years specializing in reverse engineering and exploit development, and the last 3 years doing red team operations. So of course, he immediately just said, yes, let's do that. Where do I begin? And that's ultimately why we're here in front of you today. Here we have the kill chain. It was originally developed by Lockheed Martin as a way to illustrate the stages of an intrusion into a computer network. And what we mean by stages are intelligence gathering activities, the delivery of a weaponized payload, the execution of code on a victim system, the ability to control that victim system remotely, the process of obtaining persistent access to that system, internal enumeration of an environment, the movement through that environment, and finally, the actions on objective. Exfiltrating data, modifying a database, something along those lines. Now, F-Secure has released public presentations and tooling around most of the elements of this kill chain, most notably at command and control, with the release of C3 last year. Some of you may have heard of C3 already. Essentially, the team behind C3 found that their command and control channels kept getting caught by defensive security teams and defensive security products, and so they wanted a way to push back. They found that they could tunnel their their command and control channels over existing communication channels that are often present within the enterprise, things like Microsoft Teams and Slack, and to my knowledge, they've been using it successfully ever since. Today, we're going to be talking about lateral movement. Lateral movement is made up of a number of things. Arguably, one of the most important of those is credential theft. This felt like the next logical step for us following the success of C3, but it also just felt like a really interesting space for us to investigate based on the attention and the focus that defensive security solutions place on lateral movement. Credential theft is the process of using privileged access to an operating system to obtain credential material. Here we have a computer, and inside that computer is an operating system. Inside that operating system are services that support its operation. The most interesting of these for us as security professionals is the Local Security Authority Subsystem Service, or LSASS.exe. LSASS manages the local security policy of the operating system. It manages local users and groups as well as their passwords. And it facilitates single sign-on, so that users don't need to keep entering their passwords to access resources. Ultimately, that means that it contains interesting things within its memory space. Things like passwords, password hashes, Kerberos tickets, certificates. These things can be used to authenticate yourself on a computer network, verify your identity, and so they're interesting to us as attackers because if we can compromise them, then we can impersonate legitimate users and expand our access to a target environment. This fits into lateral movement because if we compromise a workstation and we want to gain access to a target database, we find some credentials for an administrator of a server called Server 1. So we use those to authenticate to Server 1, and we compromise the credential material stored within its memory space of LSASS. We get some credentials for an administrator of Server 2. And this cyclical process, this iterative approach to credential theft, is essentially what makes up lateral movement. It's made up of many things, but you can see that it's at the core of what happens here. So we authenticate to Server 2, we obtain the credential material, and we find some administrative credentials for Server 3. We authenticate to a third server, we do the same thing, and we find some credentials to our target database, and we can authenticate. The purpose of this slide is really just to show you how credential theft fits in within lateral movement. It was a lot harder to retrieve credential material from an endpoint until Benjamin Delpy released Mimikatz in 2007. Essentially, Mimikatz is a tool that allows you to extract credential material from an endpoint. And this is one of my favorite quotes from the InfoSec community. Essentially, Mimikatz was one of the greatest contributions to InfoSec. And Benjamin Delpy did it to learn C, which is quite remarkable. As I said, you can run Mimikatz on an endpoint, and it retrieves credential material. In the glory days, it was possible to do this directly, and you could just obtain all that lovely credential material. But obviously, security products wanted to prevent against this. They didn't want this to happen. And this kind of started that struggle between the red team and the blue team, where the red team wanted to carry out an offensive operation, and the blue team wanted to prevent it and/or detect it. So to begin with, the red team started applying simple obfuscation to the tool, things as simple as renaming it to Mimi Dogs. And ultimately, in certain situations, that was enough to be able to run it and bypass the antivirus software, as you can see here. But this couldn't go on forever. And so the red team needed a way of pushing back again. And what better way to push back than not to run the tool on the endpoint at all? Essentially, Benjamin Delpy introduced support for something called a process dump, which is a file that contains the memory of a target process. Essentially, if an attacker could create a process dump of their target system, they could download it to their attacking machine, and they could run it through Mimikatz far away from any defensive security software that was getting in the way. This might sound complex, but there are legitimate reasons to create a process dump of a process, and that's why Microsoft provides this functionality. The most simple of these is Task Manager, as you can see here. You can right-click the process, click Create Dump File, and ultimately create a process dump of the process. You can also use Proc Dump, which is part of the sysinternals toolkit, an administrative toolkit for Windows environments. And there are, of course, custom implementations of these tools that do the same thing. They might use different techniques, but ultimately they result in a process dump that can be used with Mimikatz. Here we have Mimikatz, and you just say, I'd like to use this process dump, and it uses it instead of using the local host. In some cases, this process can even be automated. The LSASS is a tool that was recently released and built on top of the Impacket framework so that this can be done at scale. This is a great option when you don't need to bypass EDR products, or you're not trying to bypass detection, go undetected. But obviously, security software wanted to prevent against this as well. And they do this using something called function hooking, which I'm going to briefly describe here because it sets up some concepts that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. There are two modes of operation within a Windows environment, user mode and kernel mode. User mode is for users to carry out their day-to-day business activities, like checking their email, running Google Chrome, things like that. And kernel mode is reserved for critical operating system components. Kernel mode is a highly privileged environment, has a complete view of the operating system and its memory, and essentially is home to the core of the operating system that provides services to user mode applications. When an application wants to interact with a file or communicate over a network, it requests this service from the kernel, and the kernel happily obliges. Now, to provide some stability, Microsoft introduced a set of APIs called the Windows APIs. And essentially, they handle this communication with the kernel on behalf of the user mode application. And this is where hooking comes in. So these user mode applications, when they request the Windows API, these requests can be intercepted and redirected. And this essentially lets security software intercept and redirect certain API calls that they're interested in and assess them to identify whether they are malicious. If they're considered to be malicious, they can be prevented, but if not, they can be allowed to continue. So attackers wanted to obviously find ways around this, and one of those options is to unhook these hooked API calls. If you can identify them, there's a tool called Andrew Special. If you look for that on GitHub, it's effectively a tool based around unhooking a certain security product. And another option is to just not use the Windows APIs at all. Just use syscalls directly, bypass calling those Windows APIs. And actually, there's a company in Holland or the Netherlands called Outflank, and they have developed a tool called Dumper that does exactly this. But defensive security solutions are aware of this, of course, and they have a component of their software. All security software has a component of its software running in kernel mode. Essentially, what this allows it to do is register to the operating system for something called a callback. And the operating system will notify the security software each time a certain event occurs. The purpose of this slide is not to show you new techniques on how you can dump credentials, dump the LSASS process. The purpose of this slide is to say that these techniques are nothing new. And what we want to illustrate here is that things have got inherently complicated. They've become quite complex. And this is ultimately why Timo and I asked ourselves, is there another approach to doing this? Is there something that we're missing? Could we do this differently?
Like Robert explained, EDR has all sorts of methods for monitoring access to the LSASS process. A key observation for us was that the EDR is monitoring the LSASS process, not access to the credential material. And this led us to the following problem statement. How can we access the credential material without interacting with the LSASS process? If you look at all the existing tools for credential theft, they are all focused on LSASS and the virtual memory around it. But what is virtual memory? Basically, it's just an addressing method. Just like a street name and a number is an addressing method for your home that has a specific physical location. It's the same thing with the credentials. Yes, they do have a virtual address, but ultimately they live in the physical memory. So we decided to target the physical memory instead. So the existing attacks, they work on the virtual memory layer. We went one layer down in the stack and targeted physical memory directly. In other words, we went in from below. The approach isn't new. This has already been done by criminals, and not the kind of criminals you would expect. In 2005, the Central Bank of Brazil was robbed. And the interesting part is how they did it. It has absolutely nothing to do with computers. Instead of trying to access the vault by going through one of these massive doors or trying to explode a hole in the wall, they did something very different. They dug 200 meters of tunnel and accessed the vault from below. Now, this approach was very successful for these guys because this is one of the biggest bank robberies in history. And it remains to be seen whether this approach is equally successful for stealing credentials. So, to recap, we did the same thing as the bank robbers and went in from below and targeted the physical memory. Now, if you want to make any sense of the data in the physical memory, who are you going to call? Ghostbusters? No. You call your colleagues in the incident response team because they know how to do memory forensics. And they will tell you that in practice there's two good tools, volatility and recall. So we started this research by comparing these two, and after a very brief evaluation, we had a clear winner. Because volatility was super slow. I mean, just running the image info command, that took ages. And that gives you only the high-level summary of the image. Now, you might be wondering that, is the speed really relevant here? The way we look at this is that we wanted to create something that people actually want to use. So it doesn't really matter if you have really cool technical tricks, but your tool is so slow that nobody likes to use it. So we decided to go with recall. So what we do, we steal credentials using a tool that defenders typically use. At the other end of the pipeline, we knew that we want to be able to produce mini-dumps, because like Robert explained earlier, Mimikatz has the capability to analyze mini-dumps and extract credentials from those. In addition, we already had developed internal automation where you can just give it a mini-dump. It uses Mimikatz to extract the credentials and then forwards those to our post-exploitation toolkits. These are also the reasons why we didn't use an existing tool called PyPyCats, which on paper does meet this use case. But there is still something missing in the middle. We have all the relevant data, and we know that there is a specific file format that we want to use, but how to connect these two? This is exactly what the first proof of concept of FisMemToProfit did. It used recall to analyze an image of the entire physical memory. It located the LSASS process, then snipped out all the relevant data, and then saved that in the mini-dump file format. Now, most of the development effort here went into writing those mini-dump files. And I can tell you that that's not really the nicest or easiest file format out there. So we used a Python module called construct, but still it was quite a lot of work. However, the end result was quite nice. With the first proof of concept, you could steal credentials in 3 easy steps. First, you use those existing established memory acquisition tools like Dumpit or WinPMem to dump the physical memory. You give that memory dump to FisMemToProfit, and you get a mini dump, and then you give that mini dump to Mimikatz, and there you have your credentials. The beauty of this approach is that we're not interacting with the LSASS process of the target system in any way. And what that means is that it's very difficult for EDR to detect this. Now, even though we didn't really have to write that many lines of code for the proof of concept, the mini-dump file format is a pain. So there was quite a lot of troubleshooting and debugging involved. So I can tell you that when we finally got a valid mini-dump, gave it to Mimikatz, and got those first lovely credentials, that felt pretty great. That was a good day.
So we could steal credentials by accessing the physical memory. And what's more, it didn't cause an alert in our detection platform, which kind of gave us the encouragement we needed to continue. And we thought this was pretty cool. We thought this was pretty groundbreaking. But then on closer inspection, we realized that we perhaps had a few too many similarities to the bank robbers in Brazil than we'd care to admit. they created a fake construction company to excavate all the dirt from the tunnel they were digging to the bank. And our initial proof of concept was quite similar to this, because we would create an image of the main memory of our target, and then we would excavate that across a network. Essentially, we'd do this with dump it or WinPmem to create that main memory image. Luckily for the bank robbers, the neighbors didn't notice anything suspicious about this dumper truck going back and forth. But we have to contend with modern security products and modern security teams, and they would definitely notice such a huge amount of data coming out of their network. We knew that this wasn't very elegant from an operational security standpoint, and ultimately we knew that we needed to do better. But we also knew that dump it and WinPmem had to have a component of their software running in kernel mode, because they had comprehensive and random access to the memory. So we thought, well, what if we lose the executable? Could we interact with that kernel mode component directly? And it turns out you can. So we developed a FisMemToProfit C# server component that runs on our target host and exposes the physical memory of the device. We then run our FisMemToProfit client component, and we mount that physical memory as a file. We do this using the file system in user space or Fuse via the FusePy Python module. Essentially, FusePy or FusePy offers a simple interface to Fuse, and with less than 100 lines of Python, we were able to achieve our objective. What we do is proxy our read requests over the TCP connection. We can then use our FisMemToProfit client component to analyze that physical memory, find the LSASS process, the bit we're interested in, snip it out, and create a process dump that ultimately we can use with Mimikatz. At this point, we felt a lot less like the bank robbers in Brazil and a lot more like Leslie Nielsen in Naked Gun, The Final Insult. I'm really hoping there's some people who are familiar with Naked Gun in the audience. He was digging a tunnel out of prison, and that's how he smuggled the dirt. But this all sounds great. But as I mentioned, kernel mode is a highly privileged environment, has a complete view of the OS and its memory. And ultimately, even though we were using a tool like WinPmem, which is a robust and comprehensive piece of software, sometimes if you're using a really powerful tool like a chainsaw, you can lose a leg or end up with a blue screen of death. But we were able to overcome this and ultimately create a proof of concept that we're going to share with you now. So here we have F-Secure's detection platform. On the left, you see FisMem Demo 1, and on the right, you see FisMem Demo 2. These are two Windows 10 workstations that have our agent installed on them. We go to our attacking machine, and we RDP into FisMem Demo 1. We run host name, so you can see which endpoint we're talking about. And then we run procdump, which is commonly used by attackers and red teamers around the world, and will cause a severe detection in our endpoint platform, as you can see here on the left. We go back to our attacking machine, and we RDP into FisMem Demo 2. We run hostname once more, so you can see which endpoint we're running on. And then we run our C# FisMemToProfit server component. We give it an IP address, so it knows which interface to listen on, and we give it a port. You don't have to do this. It will default to port 8080, but we want it to be modular and flexible, so we give it port 8080. The tool starts listening. We cancel out of our RDP session, and we go back to our attacking machine. We run our FisMemToProfit client component, which connects to that TCP port, loads the kernel mode component, exposes the physical memory, mounts the physical memory, analyzes it to find the LSASS process, snips it out, creates a process dump, and drops it into the output folder, as you can see here. It is important to note at this point that we did speed the tool up for the purposes of this demonstration. The typical runtime is around 2 minutes. We go back to our detection platform, and you can see that no detection occurred. We can then use the mini dump with Mimikatz, and you can find out my super secret passwords down below. You might be able to see the flaw with our plan here, though. We're introducing something to our target operating system. We're introducing a driver that wasn't there before, and Windows Event ID number 6 driver loaded doesn't happen that often. So a defensive security team would probably start looking into that because it seems quite suspicious. And so we started thinking to ourselves, what's present on the operating system already that perhaps has access to the physical memory. And then we remembered that EDR products are commonly present in enterprise environments, and they provide functionality that supports incident response, which ultimately means they can access the physical memory. And then we thought, well, we can't just poke at a competitor's EDR products because that wouldn't be very fair just to come along and release a tool that targets them. But we could and should, as an objective consultancy, target our own. So we did. What we found, as I mentioned earlier, is that our EDR product had a component of its software running in kernel mode. As I also mentioned, FisMemToProfit has a component of its software running in kernel mode. On closer inspection, it turns out that FisMemToProfit uses the same kernel mode component that our EDR product does. And so essentially, we turned up to rob a bank with a small drill, and there was a diamond coring machine already present. We are really excited to say that FisMemToProfit is available as of right now on F-Secure Labs' GitHub. There is an accompanying blog post called Rethinking Credential Theft on the F-Secure Labs blog. But we would like to stress at the moment that FisMemToProfit was not designed to be a silver bullet for all EDR products that are out there. What we wanted to do with this research was just rethink credential theft, propose an alternative approach, and release a tool, a framework that's modular and easily extendable to support additional drivers that have access to physical memory, so that perhaps one day it could become part of the red teamer's toolbox. But on the note of extending FisMemToProfit, we were having a conversation. I was talking to Timo one Sunday, and we were saying, we want this to be a community project. We want to make sure people contribute, whether they just tell us there's a bug in it or whether they just tell us they don't like it. But we want people to get involved. And so we said, well, we should really test out how modular this is. Is it possible? Is it easy to extend it? And Timo said, yeah, do you know what? I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this tonight. I'm going to see if I can just add some functionality or add support for another driver. And then 30 minutes later, I get this text message, which, for those of you who aren't from Finland but you work with Finns, you'll know that a smiley face in a text message means he's literally jumping for joy. And those of you that work with Timo, or you know him personally, will know that this text message sums him up perfectly. You'll be working on a complex challenge, and he'll come back to you in quite a short time frame and just tell you he's already done it.
Yeah, this is actually a true story. It was my wife's turn to put our son to bed, so I had some free time. I started Googling, searching for drivers that would allow access to physical memory, and I found this awesome blog post titled "Reading Physical Memory Using Carbon Black's Endpoint Driver." This is quite nice, because during many of the red team engagements that we've had, we had to evade Carbon Black. And in this blog post, you have all the necessary technical details to read the physical memory using Carbon Black. So not only could you maybe evade Carbon Black, you could even abuse it to steal credentials. And for a red teamer, that's pretty cool. For those of you wondering whether the author of the blog post disclosed these issues to Carbon Black, according to the blog post, yes, he did. The reply from Carbon Black: this is not a security issue because you need to have admin privileges. So, fair enough, not a security issue. Let me show you how easy it is to add support for this driver in FisMemToProfit. When you run the tool, you see those output lines saying registered command. All you need to do is implement 3-4 different commands. And that's as simple as creating a single C# class, inheriting that from a couple of other classes, and then implementing those methods. Let's start with the install method. You probably didn't guess this, but it installs the driver. With the WinPM driver, what we do is we use a service to install the driver. But with Carbon Black, this is easier because the driver is already there. So we just need to call create file, and we get a handle to the device object. So all the code needed for this step you see here on the screen. The second method you want to implement is called map. And the purpose of this method is to return a list of memory ranges that can be safely accessed. If you access a memory address outside those ranges, you will get one of those deadly blue screens that Robert showed earlier. That was the root cause. So yeah, you need to implement this. There's 3 device I/O control calls. The first one authenticates with the driver, and this is a requirement that's specific to the Carbon Black driver. This is a special case. The second device I/O control, there we set the acquisition mode, and what that simply means is we select the technical method that is used to then access that physical memory, and then finally, in the last device I/O control call, we request from the driver the list of memory ranges. And then all you need to do is parse the response from the driver, and there you have it. Again, all the relevant code here on the slide. The third and final method you probably want to implement is read, and that's the one that, surprise, surprise, reads the physical memory. You give the driver a physical address and the number of bytes you want to read, then you get the response, and that's it. So not that many lines of code, 30 minutes, and suddenly Carbon Black EDR becomes the red teamer's best friend. I like that. Thank you. Yeah, we were pretty happy about this. So we were celebrating this, like high-fiving and being like, this is the greatest credential theft ever. We were so proud of this. And then we have a colleague shyly coming to us saying, guys, I'm sorry to interrupt your celebration, but have you guys heard of Credential Guard? And then I was like, sure, we have heard of Credential Guard, but that's not a problem. I mean, you need to have admin privileges on the box anyway, and if you're admin on the box, then you have access to the entire physical memory, and the credentials need to be somewhere in that physical memory, so it's not a problem. Sounds logical, but there was this minor thing that we didn't quite understand how Credential Guard works. So here's Credential Guard for you. It uses a feature called virtualization-based security. So what you have is a hypervisor layer, and then all the daily operations that you do on that computer, in reality, those happen inside a virtual machine. So all the daily stuff you do it inside a virtual machine, and you don't even know it, because this is totally transparent to the end user. But this also means that if you have those admin privileges, you have admin privileges only within that virtual machine. Now, where do the credentials live? I have good news and bad news. The credentials, this is the good news, the credentials still live in the normal world. Now, the bad news is that those credentials are encrypted. So it doesn't help you much unless you know the encryption key. And by now, you probably already guessed that the encryption key lives in another virtual machine called the secure world. Now, if you want to decrypt the credentials and bypass Credential Guard, you would need to escape a virtual machine and then read the encryption key. And you probably know that escaping a virtual machine is a pretty difficult problem. In fact, it's so difficult that Microsoft is willing to pay $250,000 US for any reports of such vulnerabilities. So in my books, this is a difficult problem. The great news is that if there is something I really enjoy doing, it's solving difficult problems. The other good news is that at Black Hat 2017, Intel researchers gave this great presentation about bypassing Credential Guard by exploiting a vulnerability in firmware. And I think the information in this presentation is really golden. I think this presentation is very underrated. So if you're interested in the topic, please go and check out the presentation. They also detailed what are the crypto methods used by Credential Guard to protect the credentials. There's 2 key concepts, and I will explain this very briefly. One is key derivation, and then the other one is authenticated encryption. Now, those key derivation functions are a challenge from an attacker's perspective. Let me explain why. Each and every credential is encrypted with a unique key, and those keys are derived. You have a master key, and then from that master key, you derive unique keys. The problem here is that if you somehow get access to the memory of the secure world and try to find those derived keys, those are not there. They are not in memory, based on our experiments. My theory is that those keys are derived on demand. So those are derived on demand, and as soon as you don't need the key anymore, it's wiped from memory. So you cannot find those keys in memory, which means that you need to find that master key. You need to find that, and then you also need to know how exactly those keys are derived. You need to know the exact details of that key derivation function. That's the challenging part. The good news is the second part, and that's the authenticated encryption. What that simply means is that for each encrypted credential, there is also a message authentication code that comes with that credential. And what that means is that if you try to decrypt something, you always know whether the operation succeeded or failed. You don't need to guess whether you had the right key. You will always know whether the operation was a success or a failure. And what that means is that if you're able to successfully decrypt a credential, it means that you had the correct derived key, which also implies that you must have had the correct master key. So this is a nice way of checking whether you found the correct master key. If you look at the output from Mimikatz on a system that's running Credential Guard, the line at the bottom there, that's your encrypted credentials. That's the ciphertext. The line above that, what Mimikatz calls Anki, I have no idea what that means. In that field, you have the message authentication code and also the needed input for the key derivation function. So Mimikatz is able to give you all the needed input values except for that master key. Now, the nice thing here is that the data in the secure world, the amount of data is only around 50 megabytes. So what you can do is you try a value from each and every offset. You try that as the master key, and at some point, the decryption will succeed, and you know you have found the master key. So here you have all the needed details of the crypto to decrypt those credentials. And even though the Black Hat presentation by Intel researchers, they mentioned the Windows crypto APIs, and they talk about the crypto, they don't give any code examples. And they didn't share any tools. So as far as I know, here, you have the first public implementation of decrypting credentials from Credential Guard. You give it the output from Mimikatz, place it in the correct variables, then you place your guess of the master key in the boot key, and then you just run this in a loop for all the values in the secure world, and at some point you get a hit, and you're able to decrypt the credentials. But this is the easy part. There's nothing difficult here. The challenge is getting access to the data that's part of the secure world. Because like you remember, even if you have admin, you're still inside your own little virtual machine. So how do you get the data from the secure world? The Intel researchers, they exploited a firmware vulnerability. And the thing is that we didn't really have any experience in exploiting firmware vulnerabilities. But hey, come on. How hard can it be? Turns out pretty hard, but we got lucky. We found this nice firmware vulnerability from 2015, and here's the result. This system is running Credential Guard. You can see the encrypted credentials there. Then we run our tool, and what it does first is it tries to access. Now remember, this is running within that virtual machine, in that normal world. It tries to access each and every page of the physical memory. if the access fails, it probably means that that page is part of the secure world. So it collects a list of these pages that cannot be accessed from the normal world. Once you have the list, then we exploit that firmware vulnerability that allows us to modify a script that is part of the firmware, and that script is executed when the computer resumes from sleep. So when the system resumes from sleep, our code gets executed, it copies all the data from the secure world back to the normal world, so we can access it normally. And then it's only a matter of running that Python algorithm you saw earlier, trying the key from every offset, and at some point you get a hit, and then you have the credentials from a system protected by Credential Guard. Thank you. Now, the key thing here isn't the technical details of this particular firmware vulnerability. The key thing is that if your firmware is not up to date, Credential Guard cannot help you. In the beginning of the presentation, we promised to deliver 3 key points.
Our first key point is that we might be able to bypass a particular protection and go undetected at a specific point in time. But attackers don't perform one action, they perform many, and they perform them all along this kill chain. It's a combination of man and machine, well-trained threat hunters with modern security software that's important. What we actually found is that F-Secure's EDR product did contain information that could be used to identify the presence and the operation of FisMemToProfit. We've, of course, notified them, and the developers of the EDR product, and they've been busy building detections ever since. Timo actually tested the tool yesterday, I think in our test environment, and it identified the tool, which was great. Now we just need to figure out how to bypass that again. Our second key point is that attackers will always steal credentials, whether that's through social engineering, whether that's because they dumped them from a file server, or whether perhaps they just found them on a file share. It's the misuse of these credentials that's important. If we have a file server admin who authenticates to a file server to carry out their day-to-day business activities, and we have an email server admin, and he authenticates to an email server to carry out their day-to-day business activities. If these 2 users have no legitimate reasons to cross paths, and they never have done before, but all of a sudden the email server admin authenticates to the file server and starts enumerating the local system, that would be a fairly good indication of something that should be investigated. Our third key point, as Timo mentioned, attacks and defenses are moving lower and lower on the technology stack. Initially, we were stealing credentials in virtual memory. We then stole credentials in physical memory. Microsoft went one layer down and built Credential Guard to defend against this. And finally, we went one layer further and attacked the firmware in order to steal credentials. Credentials aren't the only thing that Microsoft is trying to protect with virtualization, sorry. Defender Application Guard can now run Microsoft Edge in Hyper-V-enabled containers, which means that if you browsed to a malicious website and it exploited your browser and ran some ransomware, for example, then the ransomware would run within the container and your files would not be encrypted. But Microsoft cannot do all the work for you. And if you want to coerce an attacker into using a vulnerability worth $250,000, then you need to keep your firmware up to date. We recently ran this presentation at an internal event in London, and when we asked the room how many people keep their operating systems up to date, everyone raised their hand. But when we said, how many of you update your firmware as timely as you update your operating system, no one raised their hand, which is fairly telling. So our call to action is this: deploy Credential Guard and keep your firmware up to date. And with that, we would like to say thank you to Disobey for having us and open the floor for questions.
Thank you.